We're glad you're here. Welcome. Thank you for coming. We're moving through the Bible again, a third time together, but this time just hitting highlights. We moved through the Hebrew Scriptures, all 39 books of them, much quicker this time. And we'll spend more time now that we're in the Christian Scriptures, but still not dealing with nearly every verse. You're agreed to trust me in picking out parts that I think are some of the most important, most significant. And I'm grateful that you're letting me do that, and I'm enjoying going through and reading again and trying to find the things that I hope are most helpful to all of us. Let's pray. God, this book of yours has some parts that are easy for us and some parts that are very difficult for us. We're grateful that you found people into whose hearts and minds you could put these great truths, who would write them down as faithfully as they knew how. We thank you for others who risk their lives at times to preserve these holy writ, and others who've spent lifetimes learning how to translate or to comment upon these holy writings. We look to them for their help, but ultimately we count on you to help us understand and to apply what we're learning to the living of our lives. In Christ's name, amen. Chapter 10. Let's remember that, because it's been a while since we reviewed, but all of you know, is he all right? Okay. Oh, did you hear that? I said, can you hear? And she said, it's okay, I know it. That's right, that's right. Or they don't pay me enough either, but I do it anyway. Okay, we called three of the Gospels synoptics, as you know. They look alike. Now, they are quite different in many ways, but they look alike in that Mark wrote first. He wrote the briefest of the four accounts. And Mark doesn't have so much teaching material. I mean, by that parables and so on. He mostly tells you what Jesus did next, what happened next. So Matthew and Luke, we believe, took Mark's basic outline and followed it in a gospel parallel, and you can buy these. I have one in Greek and one in English in my library. You can get them at Cokesbury. If they don't have one on the shelf, they can certainly order for you. It's called a gospel parallel. And it uses Mark as the standard because it's oldest and briefest. And you can see how Matthew and Luke follow Mark right along. And then you'll see places where Luke put in a story that Mark doesn't have, like the prodigal son. And you'll find Matthew puts in a story that Mark doesn't have. But they still follow the basic outline. And for that reason, scholars have felt for 2,000 years that they were sort of like each other, synoptics. John is quite different, and we'll deal with him a little bit later. He doesn't follow their basic outline. And by that I mean just very simple things, like the three of them telling about the ministry of Jesus, recording only one time after Jesus began his ministry that he went to Jerusalem. All three of these just have one visit to Jerusalem, the one where he was crucified. John has three. And John's gospel is the reason we think perhaps Jesus' ministry lasted 3 years. He mentions 3 different Passovers. These just mention one. All of them. So John is quite different, but in other ways as well. These 3 tell you about the cleansing of the temple, and that his cleansing the temple when he arrived in Jerusalem is what got him into really serious trouble. John says, no. The thing that got him crucified was raising Lazarus from the dead. So there are differences, and we'll deal with some of those. Okay, right now we're looking at Matthew, and I told you that even though Matthew uses the basic outline of Mark, and that he and Luke both have some teaching materials in common that scholars call the quella, or Q, meaning a source we no longer have. It's similar to the Gospel according to St. Thomas, that they are both using another source of teachings that they intersperse with the basic outline of Mark. Mark starts with Jesus as an adult, being baptized and beginning his ministry. Matthew tells you about magi. Luke tells you about shepherds. Both of them tell you about genealogy of Joseph, going all the way back to David's time. So they're different, but similar. They sort of look alike. Now, Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience, we believe, a readership, and Luke is writing to Gentiles. And so it's a very different take on things. If you remember that Matthew is dealing with Jewish audience, Luke is dealing with Gentiles. And just one of the simple things I told you is that in Matthew's Gospel, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is saying, you've heard it said by men of old, do this. Well, I tell you, do even more than that. Or it says, don't do this. I tell you, don't even do that much. He's extending the Ten Commandments, and then finally says, so be perfect the way God is. And having been in one dialogue group for more than 25 years, I can tell you Jews would say, okay. But Luke is writing to Gentiles, and Gentiles have been steeped in the philosophies, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. And Plato talked about a three-storied universe: the realm of death down below, the realm of heaven and the spirits up above, and then this flat, he thought, plane where we all live. And that on this plane where we live, there is nothing that's been perfected. And I use this simple illustration of a chair. On our vacation, Gail and I would sometimes, sit on a bench in the shade and just people watch in New York and Washington, and we comment over and over. The person who made this bench never sat on one. There's a bar right here that doesn't hit you at the right place, or it's not curved in the right way, or whatever. Well, the Greeks understood that. There's no perfect chair except up there. So for Luke to tell all these Gentile readers, be perfect the way God is, it's, oh, no, you can't do that. And most Americans still come from that Western civilization. And when we use the word perfect, almost everybody says, oh, you can't do that. So Luke he's following exactly what Matthew has. Therefore be ye merciful. He changes the word, because perfect wouldn't get it with a Gentile readership. So that's what you find in comparing the Gospels. You find that each is writing to a different readership. He's aware of that, and it helps us if we can be aware. So Matthew is writing to Jews, trying to convince them that Jesus is in fact the promised, now long-awaited Messiah. And for that to be true, he has to convince them that he's greater than Moses. Because I've told you, in the monotheistic religions in the world today, there are really three. First came Judaism, then came Christianity, then came Islam. We differ at the point of who is your most significant revealer of God. For Islamic folk, there's no question about that. It's Muhammad the Prophet. There have been other great prophets, they say. Jesus was a great prophet. Moses was a great prophet. But the culmination, Muhammad. Jews say it was Moses. The most important scrolls in all of the Hebrew Scriptures, the first five. And the central figure, I know Matthew takes up a lot of time with Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and so on, but you get Exodus and Deuteronomy almost exclusively about Moses. So Moses is the key figure. So if you're going to try to convince Jews that Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah of God, you've got to prove he's greater than Moses. And that's what Matthew's trying to do. And so he duplicates many of the things that happened in Moses' life. He picks up on those things in Jesus' life and says, but Jesus did it better. Moses did it well, Jesus did it better. Okay. Chapter 10. Yeah, Gwen?
What is the basis for thinking that Mark was the first writer? Surely he is not vocabulary the way it is.
Question, why do scholars think Mark is the oldest? One of the primary reasons is that people who spend adult lifetimes working with the Gospels, and there are many. Dr. Bruce Metzger, who came and did our Barton Clinton Gordy series, had spent 40 years of an adult lifetime concentrating on the writings of the community of John. That was his thing. Gospel of John, 3 letters of John, and the Revelation. That's where he had spent his whole lifetime. Same with Dr. Raymond Brown at Yale Divinity School. Spent 40 years concentrating on one gospel. These people who concentrate and focus on the Gospels more than anything else are convinced that when you study the history of humanity, the first teller of a story tells the shortest tale. And everybody who retails adds details. No. The question was, Mark wasn't condensing from them. No, they said that doesn't happen. People, except for the Reader's Digest, don't condense. They don't condense, they add. And I can tell you I do that. When I read a great story, I thought last Sunday I had a great story from David Orr over in Springdale, Arkansas, about a mailbox in a cemetery. Okay, by the time we went off the air last Sunday, people started calling David Orr to tell him that I had told his story. I gave him credit, of course. David is now First Methodist Fort Smith. I've known him a long time. And he emailed me, I got it Monday morning, saying, thank you for, using my story and telling people who I am and so on. And then he said, you told it better than I did. Because what he did was he went back and looked up my sermon. We stream them on our website, and so he watched it. And he said, you told it better than I did. I added a couple of things that I thought clarified it and made it a little better. Okay, that's what people do. That's what storytellers do. And so, first one to tell the story tells it more simply. And every time it gets told, it has detail. He walked a long way from Jerusalem. Next one says he walked 22 miles. I mean, that sort of thing. So you add detail. In the sermon this morning, I'm adding to what Luke tells. Luke tells you that Paul went from Troas to Samothrace to Neapolis to Philippi. I think you need to know how far it was from Troas to Philippi and why he mentions Samothrace and Neapolis. Samothrace is the port. Neapolis is the other port. The 2 points of focus are Troas and Philippi, but he puts in the other 2 places because you have to sail from one and arrive at the other. And so he puts them all in. Well, how far is it from there? From Troas to Samothrace is about 60 miles, and from Samothrace on to Neapolis is about 60 miles, and then from Neapolis to Philippi is about 9 miles. When I read this story this week in preparation, I wanted to know how far. Luke didn't tell me. I looked it up. I told you. But I added to his story. So basically, scholars believe that this is simply that these men are not writing history the way you and I think of history. They're writing sermons. 4 sermons about Jesus is what scholars would call them. The sermon according to Mark, the sermon according to Matthew, the sermon according to Luke. I remember years ago, there was a Dr. Ron Meredith, who was pastor of First Methodist Church, Wichita, Kansas, for many years. And after his death, one of his children wrote about her dad. And she said, Dad did not exaggerate. He just remembered big. Okay, so you tend to remember big, It gets bigger. The story gets bigger and better. And, Ken Ingram and others have commented about the way I tell stories. One time when Kevin Tully was with us doing evangelism during his 5 years, because he needed to come in at the end of the service to see if anyone came forward to profess faith or to join our church having already professed faith, he heard the Easter sermon all 3 times. I mean, the very end. He didn't sit through the whole service. He had other things he was doing that morning, but he came in, just at the end of the sermon to be sure he could come forward. Well, at 8 o'clock service, I try to make the last sentence the one that sticks in people's minds. And one of my professors, Dr. Ruth Alexander, kept pushing me to say, preachers explain too much. They explain too much. When you make the point, sit down. Don't explain. Jesus didn't explain, she believed, and other scholars think he didn't explain. So that last sentence is important. I was visiting somebody out at Methodist Manor shortly before we went on vacation, and the woman said, "Oh yes, I round up as many as I can to watch you on Sunday morning, Dr. Biggs, and if they get to talking during the sermon, I say, you better be quiet, because he's going to come to that last sentence, and it's the key. If you miss that last sentence, you miss it." So that Easter Sunday, I'd worked hard on the sermon, and at the 8 o'clock service, I came right to my last sentence, and I said it. And we moved into the closing hymn. I didn't think it was right. It didn't quite do it. And I agonized, from 9 to 9:30 about how to say that last sentence. And at 9:30, I changed it slightly. And I walked to the sacristy afterwards saying, gee, it didn't pop at the end, There wasn't a pop at the end. And so I sat there and I struggled and I rewrote and scribbled and drew lines and things. And at 11 o'clock I told it a third way. And as the Hallelujah chorus was being sung and the minister started out the door, Kevin Tully leaned over to me and said, "If it makes any difference, you got it right." He heard it all 3 times. Okay, so a person who is a storyteller is always trying to make the story better. And scholars are convinced that people never tell with fewer details, they always tell with more. And that's a primary reason they think Mark is oldest. Not by a huge number of years, but that it's briefest of the 4, and therefore they think it's oldest of the 4. Okay, that's one of the primary reasons. Okay, chapter 10. Then Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to cure every disease and every sickness. The word disciple, I've told you before, means learner. That's its basic meaning is learner. Jesus is a part of the Jewish family. The God who sent him, the God who was in him was Israel's God, and they called their first 5 scrolls Torah, which does not mean law. It means the teachings or the instructions. So often we'll find in the Gospels it says, Jesus sat down, or when he had sat down, they came to him. Teachers sat. When Gail and I went to hear Dr. Elie Wiesel at the University of Tulsa a few years ago, he was introduced, and he walked onto the stage and sat down in a chair right in the center of the stage and gave his 40-minute address. The teacher sat, and the students stood. In many Eastern Orthodox churches, there are no pews. There are no pews. When you're a worshiper, you stand. The teacher sits. So Jesus was a teacher, and those whom he called were supposed to be learners. Learners. Okay. Now later we find the word apostle, and it's a very different word. It may refer to the same people, but it's a different function. Apostello in Greek means to send out. So he called them to come and learn. And then he sent them out to be in ministry to the world. See? Same people, different function. The word means a different thing. So first they are called to come and learn. And then he tells them, to go with confidence. Go with confidence. You remember back there in Deuteronomy when Moses is about to die and he keeps saying to Joshua, be bold. Be bold, Joshua. You have the authority of God. Dr. Charles Allen used to quote to me Mussolini, who someone asked, how did you take over the government of Italy? And he said, I saw an empty throne, and I went in and sat down on it. Take authority. When Bishop Hayes ordains on Tuesday night in Oklahoma City of this week, he will say, "Take thou authority to preach the word, administer the sacraments, and maintain order in the body." That's what ministers are told when they're ordained. Take thou authority from the bishop to preach the gospel, administer the sacraments. You know we have just two, baptism and Holy Communion, and maintain order in the body. And by maintaining order, it means do the discipline of the Methodist Church. Run the church according to the discipline. And that's not always an easy thing. When I got back from vacation, Dr. Tankersley was telling me about a funeral he had had. And the woman, the widow, wanted to have a particular song at the service. That Bobby Darin sang all those years ago. And Dr. Tankersley said, we don't do those kind of songs in a worship service at Boston Avenue. Well, this is my husband. That's what we dance to. And he said, I understand. If you want to play it at the reception afterward or something, we can help you do that. Not in the worship service. And she told him she was going to tell me and, have him run off and fired and all kind of things. And so he told me when I got back and said, has she contacted you? And I said, no. He asked me again, it was still on his heart, Thursday, has she called you? And I said, no, she hasn't, Bill. You did the right thing. Everything's fine. I had a few years ago, it wasn't so very long ago, I was over at Fitzgerald's funeral home for one of our men who had died. This couple never came to church, but they'd been members here a long time. And his wife, who was about half his age, decided she wanted, I did it my way at the service. I said, sorry, we don't do that song in our worship services at Boston Avenue. Well, why not? He did it his way. He was a doctor, and he did it his way. And I said, I'm not denying that. But the worship service is about doing it God's way. And so she got mad and went out and asked Asbury if they'd let her do it, and they said, sure. So they had the funeral out there. But I think there are times when we say, no, we're not doing that. I believe, the bishop told me, take thou authority. When Bishop Paul Martin put his hand on my head and said that to me, I've done the best I can to do that. I had a man complain that because I wouldn't let him open the casket in a service here at Boston Avenue, and he was going to call my bishop. This was years ago when Bishop Hart was still here, and he wanted his name and number. And I said, well, let me tell you a couple things before you spend your money. Number one, the bishop is not going to overrule me in my parish. He is not going to do that. But second of all, let me tell you how much he believes in keeping the casket closed. In his last church down in Texas, he not only didn't let them open the casket, he required that every casket be covered with a pall, so that people couldn't tell if the casket cost $1,000 or $10,000. All Christians were to be treated the same in the pall, and you can't open a casket with a pall on it. He didn't call the bishop. But we in the Methodist Church take this very seriously. We're not to be dictators. We're not to be dictators. We have boards and we have committees and so on, but in ordination, that word is used. Take thou authority. It's used right here. Verse 5. These 12, Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Now, I just want you to note the word again. The Torah means the teachings or the instructions. Matthew wants his readership to understand that Jesus is following in the same tradition as Moses. Still about the instruction, but that Jesus is going a step beyond Moses. A step beyond. So these words that you and I just rush past and sort of gloss over are very important to Matthew's readership. He knows that. And it helps us if we know it as well. Look what he tells them, though. Go nowhere among the Gentiles. Now, why is that interesting? Because it is Matthew's gospel, this same one, who at the very end of his gospel, after Jesus has been crucified and raised, says, go ye into all the world. It usually says in English. It literally says in Greek, go to the ethnics, meaning the non-Jews, the Gentiles. Here, during Jesus' lifetime, he would say himself, I was sent to my people Israel. I'm sending my disciples to my people Israel. After the crucifixion and the resurrection, I'm sending my people now to the Gentiles. And not only did Paul get that clearly in mind, but Matthew does too, at the end of his gospel. That's what he says. But here, at this point in this ministry, go nowhere among the Gentiles, enter no town of the Samaritans. Now remember who the Samaritans were. They were the mixed bloods. More than 700 years before Jesus, a long time before, the Assyrians had swept southward and devastated the 10 northern tribes. They replaced them, that is, those whom they didn't kill. They force-marched back to Assyria and sent others in to take their place. They raped and plundered and married, so they ceased to exist as a separate people. The Samaritans were the mixed bloods. And there's no question about how Jews and Samaritans felt about each other. Remember in John, at the woman at the well saying to Jesus, you're asking me for a drink? You're a Jew. I'm a Samaritan. We don't drink out of the same vessels. She knew. Jesus knew too. So here early in his ministry, pretty early in, he's telling them, go nowhere among the Gentiles, enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And the reason that it's very important as well, you see, is that that's what Matthew thinks his job is. Go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He's writing his gospel to Jews. Doesn't mean you and I Gentiles cannot learn from it by any means, but his primary audience, as he saw it, were Jews. Go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. As you go, proclaim the euangelion, it says in Greek, the good news. I tell young couples I'm about to marry, if they tell me they're moving to Denver, they're moving to Dallas, they're moving to Atlanta, somewhere, I say, find you a church where the preacher doesn't beat up on you every Sunday. There are lots of them where preachers beat up on folks Sunday after Sunday. That is not good news. You should walk out of the church every Sunday feeling encouraged. You should walk out of church with God whispering into your deepest heart, I know you were a Grinch last week, but I'm going to help you do this better. I know you pouted 3 days last week. I'm going to help you do this better. I know you were discouraged last week. Somebody said something to you. Somebody didn't say something else to you. I'm going to help you. It should always be about good news. Finally, when we talk about sin, I may in point 1 or 2, even 3, not 4. You have never heard me in 31 years end a sermon about sin. It's always about hope, encouragement. That's the 4th point. Every week. Hope and encouragement. Proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. And if you were here when Dr. Brandon Scott gave the series, he said, and he has spent his 40-year adult lifetime dealing with parables. Just parables. And he is convinced that every teaching of Jesus is about the kingdom of God. Every one of them is about the kingdom of God. What does it look like? How do folks act if they know themselves to be willing subjects of God in His kingdom? What does that look like? Well, here Matthew says, cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. You received without payment, give without payment. Did you see in the paper last week what they think may have caused leprosy in this part of the world? Armadillos. I read that in the paper. Down in Texas, in the Great Depression, so many people had to eat armadillos, they called them Hoover hogs. Remember? Hoover hogs. I wasn't born yet, but I've heard it talked about that way. They say that they think leprosy might have been carried in this country by armadillos. That's what I read in a couple of the magazines. All right, let's go on to verse 26. Have no fear of them, that is, those who will oppose you, for nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, nothing secret that will not become known. What I say to you in the dark, in our small group here, you tell in the light. What you hear whispered, proclaim from the housetops. Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in here, here the word hell translates the word Gehenna, which again is a valley on one side of the old wall portion of the city of Jerusalem. On the other is the beautiful Kidron Valley, where you have the Mount of Olives. On the opposite side, the Jebusites, who were there before David took this hill of Mount Zion to begin his new capital, they offered human sacrifice in that little valley of Hinnom. And so the Jews thought it had been forever tainted, and they used it as a city dump, you recall. Fire that burned all the time. All the time. That's the word that he uses here. Are not two sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father, and even the hairs of your head are all counted. So do not be afraid. You are of more value than many sparrows. And of course, by the time Matthew writes, disciples have already been crucified like Jesus. They've already been hanged, stoned. They've had all kinds of problems, so these words come as great relief. Look at verse 34. I want to comment about that just a moment. Because here we have, if you put this passage alongside a passage from John, Jesus seems to be saying two very different things. Contradictory things. In John's Gospel, he said, "Peace I give you. Not as the world gives, do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. Peace I give you." Now look here. Do not think I have come to bring peace to the earth. I've not come to bring peace, but a sword. I've come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household. And then he makes it clearer, whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. But those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. When I was right out of seminary, and Bishop Paul Martin appointed me associate minister at the Memorial Drive Church in Houston, they discovered, this was back, in the mid-'60s, when we had all the drug culture, hippies and anti-Vietnam War demonstrations, African Americans breaking into worship services and demanding millions of dollars in reparations and so on. It was a very difficult time. And the police in Houston had robbery after robbery reported out in our neighborhood, a very nice neighborhood on the west side of Houston. And then they discovered that these well-to-do kids were stealing from their own parents and taking jewelry. If they had a home safe, they sometimes kept some money in there and so on. They were stealing from their own parents and taking it out to a park, a state park, about 20 miles or so out of Houston, to these people who were quoting Scripture to them. I did not come to bring peace. I came to bring a sword. I will turn children against mother and against father and so on. And that's the way they were using this. So if you are willing to go against your father and go against your mother and steal from them both and bring the money to me, the jewelry to me, then you are worthy to be a disciple. And these kids, some of them on alcohol and drugs and so on, many of them didn't have much teaching, instruction in the faith, were easy prey to people who could take a few verses and twist them around. So what do you and I believe Jesus is talking about here? He knows that the disciples are going to go into cultures where they are not predominantly Jewish. Now, he's been telling the early disciples, stay out of Gentile countries, stay out of Samaritan country, stick with the house of Israel. But by the time Matthew writes, he knows that this faith has moved far beyond the Jewish community. And that often in these pagan communities, the text for this morning from which I'm preaching has the description of Paul's first venture into Europe. First time he left Asia Minor and went into Europe, what began to happen to him? Gets beaten, whipped, thrown into jail, treated horribly in Philippi. We'll deal with that part of the story next Sunday. This morning, the part of the story, just his arrival and the first few people he met, particularly Lydia and a group of women. But Matthew knows they are running into lots of really tough sledding here. And so the good news, when properly preached, sometimes a daughter accepts and the mom and dad simply cannot, will not. Or the son accepts and the parents will not. Or the husband does, but the wife doesn't. Or the wife does and the husband doesn't. So I believe what Matthew hears from Jesus here is, when people face a decision to believe in one God rather than many, as was true of most of the Roman Empire, to believe in one God rather than a number of gods. Paul gets into all kinds of things. Can you eat meat that's been offered to idols? First offered to idols, then sold in the marketplace. Can Christians eat that? So it's turning mother against father, child against parent, and so on. In John's Gospel, of course, the disciples are worried to death that they're finally getting it, that Jesus is about to go. He's not going to be there with them, flesh and blood, as he has been. And they are really anxious about that. So in the 14th chapter, we have those familiar words, let not your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many rooms, and so on. In chapter 15, he gets to the part about abide in me and I will abide in you. And finally, peace I give you. Not as the world gives. That is, daughter may have made a decision that no longer works with mother. Son may have made a decision that no longer works with father. Mother or father may have made a decision that doesn't work with the other parent. But when you lie down to sleep at night, I give you peace. Not like that of the world. But I give you peace in your heart, in your mind, if you're doing the right thing for the right reasons. Then there will be some who will oppose you, sometimes your own family, who will oppose you in what you're trying to do, what you believe God has called you to do. And again, to take up your cross, let's be clear about this. I hear people still say, my arthritis is really acting up. It's the cross I have to bear. Arthritis is bad. It's not the cross. Not the cross. The cross we're asked to take up is to move self out of center and put God in the center. And then to put the other person into the center. And as long as you're scratching and clawing to take life, you will lose it. And when you decide to lose your life to make God the center and others the center, you'll be surprised to find you found it. You found it. But not everybody's going to be thrilled if you take self out of center, because most of our world works on putting self in the center. It's all about me and what I want and when I want it and how much of it I want and so on. And that's not Christ's way. It's not God's way that He was showing us in Christ. Okay, let's go a little farther here. Look at chapter 11. Here again you will find a difference in the synoptics from what you find in John. In John's Gospel, very quickly, after Jesus has been baptized, John is imprisoned and beheaded. Look how far we are in Matthew's Gospel, and John is still alive. Chapter 11. See? So the basic outline of the three synoptics is not that of John. They differ. So in the synoptics, this comes a little later in Jesus' ministry when John is in prison. When John heard in prison what the Messiah was doing. Now notice here, John still has questions, but Matthew doesn't have questions. John isn't sure yet he's the Messiah, but Matthew is. The writer is sure. So already he's calling him, Matthew is, the Messiah. But John still isn't sure. Just want to point that out to you. John heard what Jesus was doing. Matthew's already calling him the Messiah. Okay, when John heard in prison what the Messiah was doing, he sent word to his learners and said to him, through them, you understand, he wants them to ask Jesus, "Are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another?" In John's Gospel, John the Baptizer said, "This is the one. This is the one I've been telling you about. He is the one." In the Synoptics, John still has questions. Are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another? Are you an Elijah kind of figure who precedes the coming? And Jesus answered them, "Go and tell John what you hear and see." He doesn't answer the question, except to say, go tell him what you see happening. Go tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight. The lame walk. The lepers are cleansed. The deaf hear. The dead are raised. And the poor have euangelion, good news brought to them. And blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me. In other words, John, you're going to have to decide in your own mind. What does Messiah do? What were you expecting him to do? Is that getting done or not getting done? What do you think, John? As they went away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. And I think this is a beautiful passage here. I think Jesus is really taking issue with the crowds and standing up for John. See what you think. What did you go out into the wilderness to look at? Now remember, wilderness is another word for desert. John was preaching at the lower Jordan down near Jericho. Those of you who were there in February were reminded that's desert. When you get down to Jericho, you have this one little oasis town, but all around it you have desert. So that's what that word means. You went down into the desert part of the country. What were you looking for? Were you looking for a reed shaken by the wind? Okay, a reed, we know, like papyrus, for you and me it'd be more like a fishing cane or bamboo, grew wherever there were oases, wherever there was water. But in the desert winds, when they blow, the reeds move. And if the wind's pretty violent, they break. And if that cane breaks, it's not ever repaired. Can't put it back together. You can splint it, and it ain't going to grow back like it was. Just the way reeds are made. So did you go out into the desert to see a reed shaken by the wind? And he expects the answer to be, well, no. What then did you go out to see? Someone dressed in soft robes? You and I know that's not the way John was dressed. Look, those who wear soft robes are in royal palaces. So what then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written. And so Jesus here quotes Old Testament Hebrew scriptures. See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way before you. And then Jesus gets back to his own words. Truly I tell you, among those born of women, no one has arisen greater than John the Baptizer. Yet the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. John is a good man, he's saying. He's a really good man. But you can be a good man, good woman too. God is willing to do even greater things through all of you. He tells the disciples, Jesus says, you'll do greater things than I'm doing. The Holy Spirit's going to come, and it's going to make it possible for you to do far more. You can go more places, preach to more people, touch more sick than I can do. Look at verse 16. To what will I compare this generation? It's like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling to one another, we played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We wailed, and you did not mourn. He's still talking about John. For John came neither eating nor drinking. And they say he has a demon. Yet Jesus, the Son of Man, came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton, a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds. Okay, Dr. Brandon Scott and others of his like mind believe that this criticism that Matthew's trying to deal with here really got Jesus in a lot of trouble. But it got John in trouble too. And Matthew sees them as being totally opposite in so many ways. John took on the role of an ascetic, a person who denied himself, who put on this leopard skin sort of the belt, the short skirt, ate bugs, wild honey, ranted and raved down there at the river. Folks came to see what he was talking about. Many waded out into the water to be baptized. Jesus didn't come dressed differently from them. No, dressed like them. And if a tax collector was having a dinner, Jesus went. Changed water into wine at Cana of Galilee, John says. So he ate and he drank and he went to the dinner parties. But people who are critical were very critical of the company he kept. I mean, he let prostitutes get close to him. Women with a flow of blood that made him ritually unclean. He touched lepers, which no one was supposed to touch. You see, Matthew, Mark, Luke believe all of that was fermenting, and the word was spreading about Jesus. And many heard the good things that Jesus is describing to John. The lame walk, the deaf hear, the blind see, the dead are being raised. Isn't that good enough to tell you that God is at work here? But others, all they saw was he went to dinner at the tax collector's house. He stopped in the middle of the street and let a woman who was ritually unclean touch him and get healed. You see? Hey, you make up your mind. And that doesn't bring peace. That can be war. That's what the earlier part's about. Some loved him, were ready to die with him, and others would scream to crucify him. He had to make a decision. Was he up to good, or was he up to no good? All right. Let's go to chapter 11, verse 25. At that time, Jesus said, I thank you, Abba. Abba is a word still used among Jews today in their families. It's commonly used. I've told you that I was at a luncheon out at the Zarrow Center. And I ended up being seated between my friend Rabbi Sherman and a member of Temple. And we had just started eating. And the layperson sort of leaned over me to say, Rabbi, did you hear that story about the kid that went running in and saying, Abba? And I didn't hear the rest of the joke. I really didn't know they still use that word, just so commonly. Daddy, Papa. And Jesus used it to speak to the Almighty, the Creator of the heavens and the earth. I thank you, Abba. I am who I am of heaven and earth. Because you've hidden these things from the wise and the intelligent and have revealed them to infants. Yes, Abba, such was your gracious will. All things have been handed over to me by my Abba. No one knows the Son except Abba. No one knows Abba except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all ye that are weary and carrying heavy burdens, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. I'm gentle, humble in heart. You will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. And this comes just a page after he said, you think I came to bring peace? I didn't come to bring peace. I came to bring war. But he meant something very specific by that. Choosing for the one true God and choosing to believe that that one true God had revealed himself most clearly in Jesus of Nazareth would bring divisions within families, within Jewish families, within Gentile families. It would. And yet there's so many other passages, you see, where he speaks of, my peace I give to you, and come, you that are weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest. So you see, they seem to contradict, but they're really speaking to two different circumstances. Is that clear? All right, let's go to chapter 13, if you would. We'll read just a little bit more, we'll be through. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Now, sea here, you know, is the lake. It means the lake. When they talk about the Great Sea, they meant the Mediterranean. And Jesus is not over on the Mediterranean. He's by the lake. So even though the Bible calls it the Sea of Galilee or the Sea of Gennesaret, it's a freshwater lake. Jesus went out of the house, and those of you who went to Capernaum with us in February, you remember it's just right there on the northernmost part of the lake. So all he had to do was walk out the door, and there he was, right at the lake. He sat beside the lake. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat there. Still, he's the teacher. He sits, and the disciples stand, while the whole crowd stood on the beach. Teacher sits, disciples stand. And he told them many things in parables. Now, Mark has almost none of those. I remind you, almost none of the teaching material. Luke and Matthew found teaching material. And because sometimes they have entire paragraphs that do not vary a single word in Greek, not a word, scholars believe they copied something. You say, how else would they have it word for word, a whole paragraph, word for word? They copied something. That's not wrong. It's not like copying on a test. They simply had some source that they both believed to be very significant that Mark didn't include. But they were aware there are a lot of teaching materials out there. He told them many things in parables, saying, listen, and here's one of them, a sower went out to sow. As he sowed, some seeds fell on the path. Birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil. They sprang up quickly because they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched. Since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain. Some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen. Sometimes you say it and people respond. And sometimes you say it and people don't respond. I went to a sales seminar in Houston many years ago. And out at it was called the Music Theater at that time. And one of the speakers said, if you are a good salesperson and you call on 4 good prospects, he's saying a lot in that, 4 good prospects, you can hope to make 1 sale. But you may make 20 presentations to good prospects and not get a single sale. You have to keep selling. The averages will take care of you. You'll sell the next 4 or 5 in a row. He said, but it's hard to pick up the phone. It's hard to go knock on that next door because there's so many times no good response. None. So with the gospel, not everyone just immediately embraces and thinks the church is the greatest thing that ever happened. There are a lot of people that say, no, I'm not religious. Or I'm religious, or I'm spiritual, but I don't go to church. I don't go to church. So next week we'll pick up at chapter 13, verse 24. That'll be June the 5th. And I will see you right here at that time. If you haven't been to church, don't rush off. One of our young women, Erin Harvey, who's now college graduate and married, has come back and is singing for you this morning. And you're going to love her.